Hi, my name is Schade, and I'm presenting to you today some research conducted at LaPop Lab at Vanderbilt University on sampling and online surveys in Latin America, specifically with the question of assessing matching versus black box approaches. What we'll talk about today is the motivation to even do this kind of research. What is the issue with online sampling? I'll walk you in some detail through our research design, and I'll present to you the findings of the study we conducted last year. Why would you be interested in online sampling? There are some promises and some perils connected with it. I'll show you some of the existing approaches and explain to you what specifically we are doing here. Why do we all love online surveys? They're cheap, they're easy to do, their reach is increasing as internet penetration is increasing around the world. And on the other side, face-to-face interviews are getting harder and harder to do, response rates are declining. On the other hand, the bad is, for us, the biggest bad is opaque sampling practices. It's very difficult to know what happens if a panel provider sells you a representative sample or something that looks like the population. You rarely know how they arrived there. Beyond that, the interviews are generally unsupervised, so there are higher rates of satisficing and other undesirable behavior with online surveys. In our region of interest, the Global South, internet penetration generally is lagging quite far behind what we see in the Northern Hemisphere. And finally, generally these are based on panels that are pre-recruited, and membership can be quite biased. You know, the people that self-recruit into a panel are generally not the same, often quite subtly, than people outside of the panel. In practice, how do people approach this issue? There's a growing spread of approaches in the US, North America, and Europe. One of the early approaches was distributing internet access to a true random sample recruited via phone or mail. Knowledge networks did this, so you give them a modem, you get them on the internet. Kronos at the European Social Survey also employs mixed modes, recruiting people in one channel and then administering the survey in a different channel. A more out there approach is the Xbox surveying done by Gelman's group in 2015. And they had quite good results with that. Our best practice that we are focusing on here is sample matching. This is a methodology employed by YouGov, mostly in the US. The great thing is it's based on census samples and it matches to those. It approximates in that way a simple random sample. No additional hardware is required. The difficult thing is that, to our knowledge, no one is yet using this type of method outside North America and Europe, so it's kind of new ground. The research question that we tackled was whether we can actually improve quality and transparency of online samples by deploying a custom sampling approach as compared to the standard sample that a commercial panel provider would offer you. How did we choose to approach this question? There were 5 big questions. Where would we do this research? How would we generate our sample? What instrument would we use to get at the same, to do our comparison? How would the fieldwork look? And then how do you analyze different samples to compare them in this type of context? Which countries? There were 3 criteria. We wanted them to lie in our region of interest, which is Latin America. We needed countries where a panel provider that would work with us on this would have proprietary panels in order to get background information on panelists. And we wanted relatively high internet penetration rates. So the resulting region that we chose was Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. How does the sampling look? The reference population was to be close to the census, and we needed microdata to conduct our approach. So we used integrated public use microdata series, IPUMs. microdata from census and intercensal survey samples. They're a little bit old, but otherwise integrated and harmonized, so they were great for our purposes. The actual population we sampled from and that the standard black box sample was drawn from is the panel that the provider owns in the areas of interest. We use samples from these panels where panelists were recruited from invitational ads on social networks. And the panel is in the hundreds of thousands of individuals per country. Now with this setup, how do we draw the sample? So sample matching, broadly speaking, starts with a random sample drawn from population microdata, preferably the entire population, or like IPUMS, a subsample. And then you randomly sample from that to get a true random sample as your target. With that and background information on available panelists, you use a distance function to pick for each record in the target sample a panelist that is as similar as possible, as close as possible to that target. And so one by one, you step through the target, you pick your panelists, and you get a matched sample that is as similar as possible to the target, but consists of actual possible respondents. Our sample, the target sample, was drawn from the most recent IPUMS microdata available, and it was a stratified random sample with a stratification based on geographic region and urban versus rural residents. And we trusted in the random sampling to sort out questions like gender and age. To arrive at a matched sample, we actually enforced a match on age decile, gender, and whether the respondent resides in the capital region. And from that, we used the Mahalanobis distance as a standardized Euclidean metric to find in a sequential manner, so target record by target record, find for each one the most similar panelist in order to get a matched sample. And this was repeated iteratively until the matched sample was filled with responses. So in each matched sample, not everyone responds. So we kind of repeat week after week until we get a sufficient number of matched respondents. And the variables used for matching were any variables that were common between the target microdata and the panel background data, included a quite large range of variables: administrative boundaries, centroids, car ownership, education, and more. And then we used a two-step sequential process. Once we had the matched sample, about 1,200 respondents per country, we then asked the provider to get another 1,200 respondents by their chosen method to get 2,400 respondents per country in our final sample. What was the survey instrument? We piggybacked on a public opinion survey that was already going into the field, about 100 questions, quite long, between 25 and 30 minutes roughly. And on that, we inserted some benchmark questions that were drawn from official household face-to-face surveys in each country. And we picked indicators that were expected to change slowly, such as home ownership, number of rooms in the household, use of government assistance, other general demographics, to then compare how well each sample did at reproducing responses to those. Fieldwork, the most crucial question was, who can we do this type of thing with? We needed someone with proprietary panels somewhere in the region of interest, and who would be willing to provide us with background data on panelists for matching. In addition to that, we needed a quite intensive exchange before and during the data collection process, and a willingness to go through these iterations and do some trial and error with us. So we found someone who fulfilled all these questions and were able to go into the field with them. For the analysis, the first thing was post-processing, cleaning. We did use post hoc calibration weights based on gender, age, and geographic region. And then we used a metric called the mean absolute error, which is an average difference across a number of benchmark questions between the proportions of respondents falling into the modal response category in the population in that proportion in the sample. I'll walk you through this because it's important for our analysis. So if we have a number n of comparison questions, benchmark questions, then for question I, the response the respondent gives, we call R sub I. So that might be the number of rooms in their house that a respondent reports. R tilde sub I is the modal response to that question I in the reference survey. So if the median number of rooms reported in household survey was 4, R tilde sub I is 4. And then the two things we compare are the percentage of respondents choosing that response in the reference. So that might be, 30% of respondents in the household survey said they had 4 rooms. That's P, and P prime is the same percentage of respondents choosing the reference modal response in the sample. Then the mean average error is the difference between the percentage choosing the modal response in the sample and in the reference, summed over all the benchmark questions. Now let's look at what we found. Oh, sorry. The variables we used are listed here for you. It's sort of questions of census population representation and some benchmark questions that you see listed here. What did we find with regards to sample quality as measured through the mean absolute error and feasibility? Here you see the mean absolute error in the benchmark questions. Y-axis, MAE, X-axis, region that we're looking at. And the bars represent the MAE in the provider sample, that's the dark bars, and our custom sample, that's the light bars. What you see here is that the light bars are generally shorter than the dark bars, meaning that the matched sample in all the countries had a consistently smaller deviation from the distribution in the reference survey, considering the benchmark questions, than did the black box sample. And in the individual countries, this difference is not statistically significant, but when you pool all of our samples together, this difference is statistically significant. And so we can say with confidence that the matched sample outperforms the provider samples on these benchmark questions that no one used to construct their samples. That's great. Across demographics, we see a slightly more varied pattern. Again, light bars are MAEs in the matched samples, dark bars MAEs in the provider sample. Similar pattern, 2 out of 3 countries, the MAE is lower in the matched sample than the black box sample. But especially when you pool them together, now you don't see a clear difference. This is partly, we think, because provider samples are generated by using quotas on these demographic variables, so we would expect them to match very well on these variables. Regardless, the matched sample still performs quite well at reproducing all of this in comparison. Now, talking about feasibility, how well are we even able to reproduce all these distributions across the population with the panel that we have? What you see here is the percentages of different education levels in the general population and in the entire panel in our 3 countries of interest. And you may see at a glance, these distributions look quite different. What I want to draw your attention to is that in all the countries, the population has a non-negligible proportion of individuals who did not finish any education level, and a quite large proportion of people with only primary education. The panel light bars, on the other hand, skews quite heavily to secondary and post-secondary degrees. So the panel distribution is severely skewed. We can compensate for that with sampling, but the low ed pool is just not sufficient to get representation in your sample. On education and other variables have similar patterns. So the panel limits what we can do with sampling. On the whole, what was gained and lost employing this special sampling approach? We saw improvements. Sample matching outperforms the standard black box approach at reproducing independent benchmark questions. And important for us as a research lab, self-implementation of any procedure allows us to tell you what we did every step along the way. We know how this sample happened, full transparency. Drawbacks, overall errors are still quite high. This MAE and reference literature comes out around 4 percentage points compared to our 6 to 12 percentage points. In addition to that, it's a lot of effort. The iterative process takes about 3 to 6 times as long as just getting a sample from the provider, and it creates significant demands on staff on both sides. So in conclusion, we're excited to say that yes, we were able to improve both transparency and sample quality with this custom sample matching approach in Latin America. It did take us significant time and effort. This whole approach could really benefit from further study and standardization, and we intend to work more on this, and we look forward to seeing what other groups come up with in this arena. Thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to your comments and questions at the actual conference.